So how did the Lion get off the rock? Where do his council of risen knights come from? And how did he acquire the Emperor's shield? Let's talk through a crazy amount of juicy lore details that come from the book that details the Lion's return. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking more juicy details from current 40k lore. And it seems that we've now finally got answers to a whole bunch of questions regarding Lionel Johnson and how he came back, his new abilities and how his character has changed, the provenance of that forest walking power, at least somewhat, and the string of protected worlds that he's established within the Imperium Nihilus called the Lion Protectorate. It seemed that when Games Workshop was writing the current lore for Lionel Johnson, they had published a little bit on Warhammer Community to give us the general idea of what had happened, but the lion's share, so to speak, of the new details would come from two different books, Arcs of Omen Book 5, and this novel by Mike Brooks called The Lion Son of the Forest. After looking at the details from Arcs of Omen, it was fairly obvious that all the major plot points for the Lion coming back would turn up in this book, not the other one. Arcs of Omen 5 is largely him arriving just in time to save the Dark Angels from destruction, but despite having his face on the cover, maybe it doesn't actually give us the biggest amount of details about him, and there's far more in this book. Over the last few days I had enough chance to have a read through myself. I must say I don't usually keep up with Black Library publications, but this one just sounded like it was a lot more interesting to the overall plot of 40k as a whole. When a primarch just turns up again in slightly unclear circumstances, it does raise a few questions. I really enjoyed it quite a lot, and I certainly would recommend if anyone fancies reading about the Lion in full. I think it really handled his return well, and I felt like the Lion bits were very well written, and a good mix of details and story about the Legion's past compared with what's happening currently. In this video, I just thought we'd talk through some of the major questions that it answers about the Lion's return. Things like his forest walking, the Emperor's shield, his reunification with Dante and the rest, and perhaps give a few thoughts on each. Obviously this is going to be quite surface level though. I thoroughly recommend reading the book if you're interested. I'm sure there's going to be stuff here that I missed, but in any case let's jump into it, and there'll be major spoilers from here on in of course. For this, I thought we'd just talk through the major themes that I was most interested in answering the questions to, and then talk through the actual plot and fighting of the book at the end. It's an interesting enough 40k battle sequence, but I'll admit the thing that had me most interested was how the Lion comes back, how he gets to be what he is in 40k, and who these risen knights are. First up, for the return of the Lion, this basically is the book detailing it. It's set before the Arcs of Omen story. That one opens with Lionel Johnson already having teamed up with the Blood Angels, so we didn't really know how he'd come back before then. In prior Dark Angels lore, he'd been known to be sleeping on the rock after being injured in Caliban. He fought against Luther and both were sucked into the warp. Luther was dragged off to the Dark Angels' interrogation cells, and the Lion was rescued by the Watchers in the Dark, placed in stasis and his wounds healed, and then has been reportedly sleeping in a secret chamber in the rock ever since, only to return in the Dark Angels' greatest need. It seems that he perhaps wasn't too concerned the first couple of times demons broke into the rock, but apparently in the Indomitus era his time has come. The book doesn't really go into detail as to how he managed to get from the Rock of the Dark Angels to the Forest of Caliban, but in our first introduction to Lionel Johnson in this book, he basically awakens in the mysterious dreamlike forest that he can do his forest walking in. He's fully armoured though completely unarmed, and initially at least he's got no memory of who he is or where he is, and never gets any further memories that he has between the Horus Heresy and now, implying that he's probably been asleep all along. As we'll get onto in a second, he's got a mysterious ability to travel between worlds, and it sounds like he's instinctively done this in his sleep while he was on the rock, and that's what's conveyed him to the dream forest where he finds himself. There's also Watchers in the Dark present, so it's possible that they could have taken him, but given that he seems to be the one that manifests this power, I guess it's probably going to be him that generated it. In terms of timing of it looks like when he eventually does make it to real space, it does turn out to be the Indomitus era, so it looks like it's a recent awakening for Lionel Johnson. So it sounds like it's a recent awakening for Lionel Johnson. It doesn't seem to be that he's been operating for millennia, and as soon as he does start to make contacts with Imperial forces, he tries to make himself known and contact as many more as possible, rather than trying to hide away. That seems kind of sensible, to be honest. I kind of feel like if they'd just written in the lore that he's been travelling the galaxy ever since, that would have been a bit strange. Would just seem a bit weird for a Primarch not to take up a bit more responsibility, in the face of all the horrors of chaos being unleashed around them. Otherwise, at the start of the book, everything feels a bit allegorical or metaphorical, perhaps. This dreamlike forest that he can walk in seems to have a fair few metaphors thrown in. He passes by an injured king who he can't reach due to some shadowy figures in the dark, pretty clearly meant to be the Emperor, and perhaps the Chaos God stopping him from achieving his purposes, perhaps. During this sequence, he does communicate a fair bit with the Watchers in the Dark. They don't really speak as such, but are more sort of communicating to him via telepathy. And at least in this book and lore, the Watchers in the Dark only seem to appear in these dreamlike sequences, even though his model has them in 40k. They don't really take a more direct role carrying his stuff about or anything. That does seem to be the main gist of it though. It looks like he got out of the rock via his forest walking ability that he can mysteriously now use to travel from planet to planet. My guess is that we're not going to get any other in-depth explanation besides that, though I guess seeing as he was waking up with no memory and everything, there might be enough narrative room to add another story in there. I can't help but think that that would feel kind of contrived though. If he did want to feature another Lion narrative that happened after the heresy but before 40k, he would have to conveniently forget all of it, and that might just feel a little bit cheap. The Lion that's returned to 40k though has changed quite a bit from his days in the heresy. One of the first reactions to people seeing his miniature was just how much the model appears to be older than his heresy counterpart, and that does play out in the narrative here. Apparently he's older, not quite as mighty as he was, both in terms of appearance and combat prowess. Even one of the Chaos Lords that he fights during the book says that he's got old, though I must admit that quip does feel a little bit off considering that the Lion has just basically beaten him anyway. In this book, perhaps he has a little bit more trouble against Space Marine level heroes than you might expect a Primarch to have, though it does seem that by Arcs of Omen he's got enough strength in him to duel Angron for a protracted period of time. Certainly in the narrative of this book, I feel like if that had happened earlier, Angron would have got the best of him very, very quickly. Character-wise, perhaps compared with his days in the Heresy, he's very focused on helping the embattled human populaces on the worlds that he travels to, and also to do right by his brother Dark Angels, particularly the ones now considered fallen if they hadn't actually been tainted by the touch of chaos. He seems a lot less willing to sacrifice allies and friends for the greater win than he might have been in the Heresy days, and it's perhaps a little bit less callous and calculating than you might expect of the current fluff of Warhammer 40k, which often puts the emphasis on great sacrifice of Imperial worlds if it will protect the Imperium as a whole and stop a greater threat spreading. This newfound humanitarianism does come at a bit of a cost, and it very nearly gets him killed towards the end, as he doesn't put the finishing blow on a Chaos Sorcerer, in case doing so might well risk the lives of his risen knights. Just beyond that, he's far less hot-headed and perhaps abrasive than he might have been in the Heresy, a lot more willing to work with people and trying to earn their trust through mutual respect, as opposed to dictating orders and knowing that he's right. In general, the outcome perhaps tends to be the same though, as I wouldn't imagine that many people in the current 40k setting are going to go against the will of a Primarch. It's also pretty interesting to see his reactions to the current 40k galaxy as well. He's pretty much a man out of his time, and basically having had a massive time skip between the Heresy and now. He's kind of annoyed that Gilliman presumes to break his legion down into chapters. On learning of Abaddon, he describes him as one of my brother's wayward sons, and he'll deal with him if their paths cross. He's certainly somewhat sceptical about the worship of the Emperor as a god, and I thought his reaction to seeing some Helldrakes in the Chaos Fleet was kind of funny as well, basically asking if there was anything that hadn't got worse since he'd been away. As mentioned before, perhaps one of the biggest developments lore-wise for the Lion is that he's got this new forest walking ability. Perhaps one of the most surprising areas of lore development in current 40k, given that in the past the Lion always tended to be a bit more of a grounded and real-world Primarch, as opposed to being one of the more supernatural ones. I guess the Dark Angels aren't without a few of their supernatural things, like those Watchers in the Dark that hang around them, but gaining an ability to basically warp teleport at will is kind of surprising, I thought. He only uses the ability 3 times in the book, and then once in the Arcs of Omen one. The way it seems to work is that he passes from place to place. Initially he uses the ability to presumably escape the rock, and then the forest walking delivers him to the backwater world of Kamarth. It itself also a densely jungled world with a bunch of horrors in, a bit of a home away from home from the Lion. Initially, for the first couple of times, it doesn't look like he's got that much control of it. He simply wakes up in the forest the first time, and then he's instinctively drawn to an area of a forest on a different world that he thinks is going to be able to do it, and that's what allows him to get to the second planet on his stop on this quest. And then after that, he thinks that he should probably try and get a handle on this, does a bit of meditating during a journey, and then that seems to do the trick to allow him to basically warp jump at will. It looks like the ability isn't necessarily locked to actually having to be done in a forest or anything like that. He manages to do it from a cargo hold to an enemy palace. Regardless of location, it still seems that he can make the trees happen. Some green mist descends, and they venture into a canopy, walk in the wood between the worlds for a little bit, and then come out where he needs to. I guess in 40k's past, most of the Primarchs have generally had at least some sort of warp presence, and a lot of them have got unnatural abilities of one sort or another. I guess in current 40k that's going to be the Lion's version of that, even if maybe in the past he's been a bit more of the solid and physical down-to-earth ones. It's not really entirely explained exactly how this works mechanically within the 40k fluff, and hazard a guess that it might be essentially warp travel through the shards of Lost Caliban that was broken down and scattered in the warp, even if Vashtor has put most of it back together again. I suppose it doesn't take quite as long for him to get place to place as warp travel does though, so maybe it could be some sort of webway thing perhaps. It seems that either way is able to get through things like teleport jamming fields, which is a key plot point towards the end of the novel. As transport abilities go, it does seem to be pretty OP. As well as just getting from place to place though, it also looks like the forest walking is handy enough for picking up the odd relic. Other questions that I have for this book would be how he'd get his new sword Fealty, and how he'd acquire the Emperor's shield, as he starts the book completely alone and unarmed, and he has to start fighting the first Chaos Space Marines he meets with nothing but his bare fists. Fealty, his new power sword, he does acquire fairly early in the novel. He's fighting against some Chaos Space Marines in the armory of a shattered Space Marine chapter fortress, looking around for a decent weapon with which to defend himself, and he notices a power sword stuck in some rocks, though it does appear to have some trappings of his mysterious warp forest, with some canopy leaves overhead and some green mist around it. It does seem like he's very much going down the whole tropes of Arthurian legend, as it's literally a sword that he pulls out of the stone, very much showing that he's a worthy knight, I'm sure. The Emperor's Shield, on the other hand, he doesn't really gain until the main antagonist of the book is defeated, a bit of a last action piece, and it has been kind of built up to as a test over the course of the book, a building that he shouldn't really venture into in his great forest until he is truly ready, at least according to his helpful watchers in the dark that lurk there. I was kind of curious how he might get his hands on a relic of the Emperor, to be honest. I would have guessed that such things would have been under massive lock and key, or set on a world with some absolutely enormous defences, but it does seem that the forest magic is going to be carrying the lifting for that part of the story. The sequence in which he does get gifted the shield, though, is kind of cool. He gets to fight basically a warp demon type thing that takes the shape of each of his brother primarchs in turn. Perhaps interesting enough that we get to see just a little bit of interaction between each one of them when he wouldn't normally be able to. As he battles against the demon and shows that he's up to the challenge, the shield materialises onto his arm. He suspects that the Emperor's direct will. Then he uses it to banish the demon, crushing it beneath the shield. His lore is that when it's attacked, it can reflect the energy back at the attacker. I think it might have been a bit more interesting if there was some actual real in-galaxy way that he got a powerful relic, as opposed to just it coming out of the warp mysteriously. But I guess there's maybe just not all that much realistic explanation for why the Emperor's shield might be out in the Imperium Nihilus all by itself, and if it was, I feel like you might need a fair chunk of the book to actually dedicate to going to find it, which might have detracted from the main narrative, I guess. One of the other most interesting things as well is that Lionel Johnson appears to be travelling with a bodyguard of Redeemed Fallen Knights. Unless I missed it, they don't seem to get an official name here, so I'll go with Redeemed Fallen for now. For how hard the Fallen usually are to find, there do seem to be really quite a lot of them springing out of the woodwork in this book. With how much the Dark Angels hunt them, you'd expect that you might struggle to find more than a few or so. But again, it looks like the Lion's forest magic helps out a bit here. He seems instinctively drawn to the first few of them, and then when he's found a few and announced his presence to the galaxy at large, that draws a whole load more. Either he or his friends seek them out, or they actually come looking for him. Perhaps the most interesting thing about these is that in general these are non-Chaos Fallen, something that's been kind of a rarity in Warhammer 40k. They're the Dark Angels who are stationed on Caliban and basically betrayed the Lion and fired on his returning fleet when he returned home to Caliban. It seems that from this lore, the vast majority of the Fallen on the homeworld were just entirely ignorant as to the plans of their higher-ups. It was mainly the treachery of Luther and his inner circle who actually fell to chaos. Just in itself, that's a fairly decent change to the 40k lore. In the past, the vast majority of documented Fallen throughout all of 40k's history have usually been Chaos ones, so trying to flip the idea on its head and saying that perhaps the vast majority of Fallen aren't necessarily fallen to Chaos is quite a major shift. Apparently from their point of view, a lot of the Fallen have just been needlessly hunted by the Dark Angels, even though they had no idea of what initially caused the conflicts between Caliban and the returning Dark Angels fleet, and have just been living in exile to escape the wrath of their little brothers, as they call them. In the Heresy, Lionel Johnson basically divided his legion in two, sent a lot of it back to Caliban to recruit and train and build up the legion's strength, when the main force of the Dark Angels went around and tried to win the Heresy against Horus. A lot of the Dark Angels on Caliban basically hated him for abandoning them there, and apparently a fair few of the higher-ups questioned the Lion's motives and whose side he was really on if he was going to keep such a large force out of the war that might be able to turn the tide against Horus. It at least sounds like from this book that there were multiple different plots going on for the Lion's return to try and ambush and kill him, even with Dark Angels that weren't necessarily aligned to Chaos, which does maybe seem a little bit extreme, just literally for being put on garrison duties. Apparently since the reunification, where Caliban fired on the Lion's fleet and then the Dark Angels destroyed the planet, a lot of the Fallen in exile basically subsequently hate the Lion due to attacking Caliban. Their last memories of him are just a great big Primarch destroyer coming back to destroy the rest of their legion, and they didn't even know that their planet fired first. Overall, it's quite a lot more complicated than just the Dark Angels on Caliban were all Chaos, and apparently there's a whole load of Heresy-era Dark Angels out there who could be potential Imperial allies if the Lion can persuade the current Dark Angels chapter to stop hunting them down and executing them. In this book, the Lion gathers rather a lot of Fallen to him, and I did find it kind of funny that he is basically building himself a Knights of the Round Table collection. There's a whole load of Fallen here who basically have names that are very, very similar to the names in the Arthurian legends. The first redeemed Fallen that he meets is Zabriel. He's a Destroyer Squad veteran from the Heresy who fights with paired bolt pistols. He's one of the book's other major viewpoint characters, and initially on meeting the Lion, he brings up his bolt pistols to try and kill him. For the above reasons, thinking that the Lion himself was the traitor, he betrayed the Legion and not the other way round. It's kind of interesting all the different sources that these Fallen turn up from. Zabriel's been around for 400 years, and he's been defending a group of humans on Kamarth, a planet that's largely been taken over by chaos, but there's a bunch of humans hiding out in the wilderness. Then he adds his next bunch of Fallen on the world of Avalus. There's a trio of them hiding out there in a city. A chap called Afkar, who's a sergeant who trained Zabriel, but due to time dilation he's actually a fair bit younger than him now. A brash duelist called Knight Commander Kai. Again, he initially attacks the Lion and only yields to him when he gets defeated, but isn't killed. And then a mysterious character who's got a plasma gun. He's called Lohawk or the Red Whisperer. Seems like he's been deliberately set up to be a mystery character who could be a big reveal at some stage if it was wanted. He always keeps his helm on, keeps his hood up, and has a distorted voice due to it being injured somehow. He could just be a Dark Angel who enjoys being mysterious, or he could be some major or minor character from the Heresy in disguise. It isn't really gone into any further. Otherwise, the other reinforcements that he gets are from Knight Captain Bors alongside a pirate fleet, and they've got a whole bunch of people manning another pirate station under Knight Sergeant Gawain as well. He also picks up an apothecary and a tech marine there, so he's filled out his command squad fairly well. Then there's another couple of Fallen who are basically leading a couple of Forge Wounds on Gamma, a Cenobite Galad and Launciel, and hiding out in the wilderness on their planet as well is an old librarian called Beverdan. Initially had sworn off combat, but agreed to join their fight. Between that's rather a lot of Fallen reinforcements altogether. None of these have apparently been significantly tainted by chaos, and I did find it kind of funny just how many of them have their names based on the Arthurian Knights of the Round Table. We've got near analogues for knights like Gawain, Lancelot, Bors, Galahad, Bedivere, and Avalon in the planet of Avalus. The Lion also pulls the sword from the stone as well, and there's also the tail of the Green Knight thrown in here as well. I'm going to guess that I'll be missing a whole load more references. Feel free to let me know any other Arthurian legend things that you noticed down in the comments. With this force of redeemed Fallen at its core, the Lion establishes a Lion Protectorate, a string of fortified worlds, initially centered on the title worlds in this book, Kamarth and Avalus, and also comprising of those Galamoons that some of the Fallen were found on. A bunch more join after this. It's basically an area of space and worlds defended within the Imperium Nihilus, after they've been so cut off from other Imperial reinforcements. Initially, throughout pretty much most of the book, it's not even clear whether the rest of the Imperium even still exists after the formation of the Great Rift. There's no world from Terra, and they can't see the Astronomicon, and astropaths can't send messages or anything, so it really is just about every world and system for itself. While building this little region of fortified space, the Lion's very clear about his motivations about it. He's saying that he's just offering defense and protection for humanity. He's certainly not aiming to build his own empire or usurp his father's authority or anything like that, but cut off from all support, he feels that this is the best option. After putting this all together though, eventually he does meet with Dante, and it sounds like there's perhaps been a short time skip between the end of the novel's main story and when Dante shows up with his Thunderhawk gunships and his Blood Angels. In the Arcs of Omen books, it's clear that the Lion's purged at least a few lesser Arcs of Omen alongside his fallen knights. You can tell by the forest magic warp travel. That isn't gone into in this book at all, so it kind of makes sense that that happened while he was building his Lion Protectorate and happened off camera. The Blood Angels send a fleet to basically investigate what's going on, and the rumours that Lionel Johnson is back, which admittedly he has been broadcasting out to the galaxy. He's sure that if he'd actually turned out to be a false prophet, they'd probably been dispatched to kill him, but when Dante does meet him, there's no doubt in his mind whatsoever. I guess primarchs are kind of hard to mimic. The details of the meeting really are quite brief. Initially though, he's just very angry that Dante is wearing the face of his slain brother as Sanguinius' death mask. I guess from his point of view, Sanguinius didn't really die all that long ago when he was back in the Heresy, and he's very much a recent brother and friend, as opposed to a long ago figure of myth and legend. Dante removes his death mask and kneels before the Lion, Lionel Johnson accepting his offer of support. Dante basically catches him up on current 40k lore and tells him that Guilliman is still alive and has returned to the galaxy, and I guess this basically leads directly on to a setup at the end of the Arcs of Omen, where the Lion is on the Dark Angels' battle fleet and is making haste to help out the Dark Angels. Finally, for the actual plot of the conflict, while all of the above is being set up, they are actually fighting against some Chaos warbands, though as you might possibly expect, Out of who's going to win versus Lionel Johnson versus some previously unheard of Chaos Warband, I think most people's money was probably going to be on the Primarch. The main antagonist in the book is a fallen sorcerer called Seraphax. He's been gradually subjugating this area of space alongside his lieutenant Baylor, also one of the Fallen. These guys lead a combined Chaos Warband called the 10,000 Eyes, which looks like it has multiple different elements, some Slaneshi Space Marines of the Dolorous Guard, some blood-mad former World Eaters I believe, some Chaos Beastmen, and a whole bunch of others. Seraphax feels like he's a fairly stereotypical Chaos Sorcerer, though he does have some pretty interesting and different motives it turns out. He very much enjoys his grand rituals, making plans that are far greater than any one conflict, and using all of his followers expendably towards those plans. Maybe a fairly standard Chaos villain. When the Lion emerges from his forest walking the first time, he marshals the survivors in a ragtag band to take back the backwater planet of Kamarth, which kind of feels like a Caliban in microcosm. Chaos holding the cities, and great beasts roaming the jungles that might have been mutated via the Great Rift. Initially he leads a personal assault on a Chaos-held bastion, and that's where he gains fealty. After Kamarth is retaken, he then forest walks to the imperial world of Avalus. There he's basically welcomed pretty much with open arms, and he decides that he's going to broadcast that he's returned to the wider galaxy to hopefully let the rest of the Imperium know. As the people planetside do tell him though, this does nothing but attract the attention of a nearby Chaos fleet, attacking with what should be an overwhelming force and far more than the defenders of Avalus can muster. The Chaos fleet is very big but uncoordinated, and it's overcome with strong command from the Lion, who makes the smaller numbers of Avalus's fleet count for much more, and also the timely arrival of a nearby fleet of Fallen, who also help tip the balance, also drawn in by his beacon. In retaliation for his defeat, Seraphax decides to burn Kamarth to try and provoke the Lion into attacking. He leaves his Slaneshi champion Markog behind, who basically plays out the Arthurian legend of the Green Knight, the one where the knight agrees to take a blow if he can give one back to the Fallen who deals it later, and in return he'll tell them where Seraphax is hiding. Being Slaneshi and a bit messed up, he doesn't seem to be too put out when he gets his head cut off and just carries it away. The Lion and his risen knights follow to the coordinates that Seraphax gives them, and it turns out to be a world called Sable, a previous imperial world that's now Seraphax's strong points, all set up for a great big ritual, with all the bones of the planet's populace laid out all nice and ready. The Lion chooses only to take a single ship to Sable rather than the rest of the fleet, his plan being to use a tactical forest walk to jump into the palace and maybe get the surprise on Seraphax, who won't be expecting that. Fortunately, he does manage to learn how to do it very well mid-flight. This allows him to get planetside without getting shot, and then fairly easily overcomes Seraphax's guard plus Markog. The redeemed knights don't really play very well into the whole Green Knight myth and just decide to kill him. While his knights are all busy fighting Seraphax's guard, Seraphax manages to capture the Lion in some great big iron chains, and does a nice little villain monologue as to how he's going to basically drain the Lion's soul and then replace his body with basically a flesh puppet to get close to the Emperor in the hopes of killing him. He would have been happy to use any mighty hero of the Imperium to do so, but Lionel Johnson as his Gene Father seems appropriate. Interestingly though, his eventual motivations turn out to be that he actually wants to do this so the Emperor can be kind of set free and be reborn as his own warp god. Seraphax believes that the Golden Throne and the Emperor's continued existence is what's stopping this, and it is something that's been teased in multiple other stories before, the potential that the Emperor, if the Golden Throne fails and he dies, will be reborn into some new and greater form. I believe it was also teased in a recent sci-fi book as well, who he was trying to get closer to potentially kill the Emperor, where it seems that from the Emperor's point of view he feels that the time isn't right for this yet, and for some reason he thinks it's better that he's in a state of undeath at the moment. As with just about any minor Chaos character with grandiose ambitions though, that all comes to nothing as he's basically betrayed and killed. Baylor, his lieutenant, basically comes to the Lion's rescue, so Seraphax doesn't get to use the Lion as his flesh puppet after all. Baylor's mortally injured, and Lionel Johnson gives him a clean death with fealty. He was probably already too tainted with the touch of Chaos to be fully redeemed. Overall, I definitely enjoyed the book, would thoroughly recommend if you fancy giving it a go, and it did deliver on far more answers than the Ark of Omen book did. We learned how he got his sword and shield, how and when he got off the rock, which was kind of implied with the forest walking thing, a bit more about how that ability actually works, and how he meets with Dante. I feel it's kind of interesting that he's going to be taking up the trope of basically King Arthur of Warhammer 40k. I kind of wonder whether we'll see a few more tropes of that happen if he gets further novels and books. Perhaps some of the most interesting details were just how he interacts with modern 40k things, and what his perspective is on them straight from the heresy. Must be a bit of a disconcerting time skip for him. In any case though, let me know what you think. Are the secrets of Lionel Johnson's return what you might have expected? And what do you make of his contemporary lore? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to keep up with Games Workshop's news and updates, particularly the gaming things, but also occasionally big things from the lore that interest me. If you have been enjoying videos like this on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you're interested in helping support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.